Being a chartered manager means that you are a specialist in that area, and it means you've got all the skill to do the job to the best of its ability.
You are seen as a leader, a true leader who has credentials behind the great work you've already been doing.
It's enhanced my understanding, it's enhanced my skill set, it's improved my mindset.
It makes all the difference.
This session is recorded and will be available on the CMI website and YouTube channel. Join the conversation by using the live chat box for your questions and comments. We'll answer as many as we can during the Q&A.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Building Effective Teams to Achieve Innovative Talent Development digital event. My name is Mary Bolaole, and I'm an event delivery coordinator at CMI. Don't forget to join the conversation by using the live chat box, and feel free to ask any questions you have for the speakers, and we'll answer as many as possible during the Q&A session. I'll now hand over to Dalton Leon, the chair of the CMI Southeast Regional Board, to begin today's event.
Thank you very much, Mary. Very, very warm welcome to you all. We have nearly 400 people registered for this, so that's fantastic. I'm Dalton Leon, chair of Southeast Regional Board. Delighted to bring you our latest webinar, and my thanks to our brilliant events lead, Matthew Platt, for coordinating everything so efficiently behind the scenes together with the CMI events team. As Mary has said today, for the next 60 minutes or so, our subject is building effective teams to achieve innovative talent development. I guess brought more into focus since COVID hit our shores in 2020, and understanding the ever increasing pace of change that we're all working in. There's an acceptance that full-time permanent employers are no longer the sole route to delivering value. We've had to become more flexible and agile in the way we work. Remote and hybrid working are here to stay, and the need to adapt to our environment is ever present. So, what are the best, or should I say, the most effective workforce models, and how do we approach how we develop our talent pool? I'm delighted to be joined by two industry experts. Let me quickly introduce or ask them to introduce themselves before we get underway. John.
Thank you very much, Dalton. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm John Marsh. I'm a partner in EY, where I've been 18 years. I sit in our people consulting practice. I'm also a non-exec director in the NHS, actually work alongside Dalton in that role. So looking forward to sharing some thoughts with you in a moment.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. And Bernice?
Thank you, Dalton. So I'm Bernice Rook. I'm Deputy CEO at Eastside People, Director of the Eastside Primetimers Foundation, and I'm also a trustee at Board Racial Diversity UK. My background's in recruitment and occupational psychology, and I've worked in workforce development, talent assessment, and the human side of organisations throughout my career.
Brilliant. So we're delighted you're both with us. The format's going to be 50-minute presentations from both John and Bernice, and then that will be followed by a question and answer session. So please do send in your questions in the live chat, as Mary has said. I will have a short session just with the panelists initially, just to have some sort of panel questions, but we have also got some pre-submitted questions. Bit of a juggling act, because depending on how many of your live questions come in, we'll have to make sure that we can cover as many as we possibly can. So thank you for your understanding if for whatever reason we cannot cover every single question. Okay, so let's kick off. Shall we start with you, please, John?
Thank you, Dalton. So let me move on to my agenda in terms of what I'm looking to cover over the next 15 minutes. As mentioned, I'm a partner at EY, so drawn quite a lot on some of our research. Dalton referenced since the pandemic, the world of work has changed a lot. We've run some surveys, Workforce Reimagined, they've looked globally, they've looked within UK as well. So I'll just be referencing some of those findings from those ongoing surveys we've done. So I'm going to start off with looking at that. What is an outsourced workforce? What does the different descriptors for workforce look like? In the part two, then draw on some of that research finding. And then I thought it might be useful to just provide a couple of frameworks around how then you can workforce plan within your own organisation. And finally, I should be touching on, it might be a bit much for me to go too much into detail, but let's not forget some of the tax implications with these more complicated workforce arrangements that we now have. So if I first of all kick off with our different type of workers. So I find it interesting myself just to reflect on what does the world of work look like now in terms of we traditionally used to think of permanent, and then we might have had contractor workforces. And yet when we now unpick what does contractor workforce actually look like, it has changed considerably with different nuances over the last 5 to 10 years. So we're comfortable with the notion of a contingent worker, or a contractor. That would quite classically be the type of person you might bring into your organisation as a sole person, working with you maybe 6 months, could be covering maternity leave. We then start to have different type of workers, such as gig or platform workers. And these workers, again, are a more recent phenomenon. They'll maybe be just being brought in for X number of hours to do a particular task. They could be working for multiple employers, and their work patterns, work choices are often remote and much more akin to providing a service. Again, we're familiar with the concept of consultants. So these will be more classically used when you've got a defined output that is required, typically procured through statements of work, and it can be individual, it could be multiple people, but again, you're buying a service. And then on the right-hand side, I've referenced temporary workers. So again, we've lived with agency workers for a very long time. And as an employer, one sometimes having to look at whether you're sourcing through an agency, which is one particular set of requirements, or whether you're actually sourcing directly yourself, which again means that you need that internal infrastructure. So just thought useful when we're looking at this adaptive workforce that there are a number of badges and labels attached to different type of workers. So these next few slides, as mentioned, I'm drawing on some of the research that we've undertaken. And again, I'm sure a number of you will have just through your web searches also been seeing some of these trends which take place. So the approach to look at talent in terms of that adaptive, innovative talent development is one through the lens of the employer, two, so critically, through the lens of the worker themselves. And I'm deliberately having to remind myself to say worker rather than employee. I'm much more used to having to think around employee value proposition, talent strategy, thinking about permanent worker. What we are now saying is that you have to think about your talent strategy regardless of the sourcing route for that particular worker. So a couple of statistics which I felt are pulled out and really highlight the shifting talent environment. 70% of employers are now needing new skills. And again, other research has shown that the type of skills that we might have been learning in the 1980s, those would have held good for up to 30, 35 years. New skills learned now might only have a life shelf of 5 years. So we're all having to be incredibly adaptive, and that does present different challenges for employers as they're constantly having to either develop own skills or to bring in where they've got some gaps. Second, we're all very familiar with the concept of the global talent shortage. So again, another reason why there cannot be a presumption of permanent employment. We're having again to adapt our own talent a strategy and approach to recognize employees or workers have much more choice than previously they would have had in the past. And then finally, there is something around workers looking for much more of a personalized expectation of career. Again, we're hear a lot in the media around the different working expectations beginning back with baby boomers right through to Gen Zs now, and they have very much different expectations, and how you again manage that talent, how you change your offerings are going to be really crucial for those different workforce requirements. So that then is around needing a shift more from the management of workers and people who are delivering a service, and starting to look again about how you actually are empowering people. Couple of features again to just pull out from this slide. Traditionally, and I'm going to come on to workforce planning in a moment, we're moving from thinking about roles to thinking about skills. So in EY, we're working with a number of clients who are considering themselves to be skills-based organizations. Strategic workforce planning traditionally would look at your FTE, your full-time equivalent, and it will be looking at it more from a numbers perspective. We're now having to look at it from a capability perspective. Another observation in number 3 here is, again, in terms of thinking around what outputs are you looking for from workers, that output now is not just from a worker, it is also being made, it is an output from use of technology. I myself have just been granted access to Microsoft Copilot. There are great pains to stress the co-piloting word. So I, as a user, remain in the driving seat. I'm the accountable decision maker, but I'm very much aided by the use of Copilot in Microsoft, similarly how Gen AI is used. So employers and HR need to start thinking about this. There may be different ways in which work can be delivered other than through, again, that more traditional concept of needing another head, another person, where there might be a bit of a capability gap. So this then has some requirements in terms of what to do as an employer. Again, you have to very much look at your talent strategy, your reward strategy, your well-being strategy. And this is slightly different from, again, a traditional strategic workforce planning strategy. So I won't labor it. These slides will be available, but this then just encapsulates what you need to do in terms of how you manage going forward. So for the next section, I'm now going to move to how you should, ways of workforce planning. So when looking at your talent, you're going to have very different requirements from your different executives, from your different functions. If you just take the classic CFO, Chief Finance Officer requirement, they're going to be asking of HR about the impact on labour costs, and again, how you just get productivity from your total workforce. If I think about my environment where I'm working as a non-exec director in the NHS, productivity, again, is the number one topic at the moment. And again, you're having to look at that alongside what can you do by use of digital. So it is not, again, just looking at headcount. It's also looking, again, at other enablers, which are going to enable you to be that much more effective. That then leads on to a CIO discussion in terms of what will be that impact of digital technology. And then for a CHRO, what type of different skills am I actually going to need as I then look at my workforce planning? If we then move on and have a look at a particular framework which can be used for strategic workforce planning, as I'm sure most of you are more than aware, any workforce planning has to be derived from your business strategy, so your 5-year outlook. Again, if I just continue with the NHS analogy, the previous government had a long-term workforce plan. The new government is grappling and will be publishing a long-term workforce plan shortly. That, from a strategic workforce plan, had to look 10 years plus out. So if you're going to have surgeons of the future, radiologists of the future, you have to then engage with the Royal Colleges, with the universities. So it requires an incredibly long-term perspective, which is very challenging in a health environment. And that therefore requires looking at long-term health trends. So you start off then with what is my business demand going to be? And then how am I going to provide that supply side in terms of that outlook? That then is also starting to look at location. So again, in the workplace, how many people physically need to be in the workplace? Can work be delivered globally? Can work be delivered remotely within UK? And then you're starting to look at the actual cost of that particular workforce and some of that mix and numbers of workers and the choices that you might have. Finally, I'm just going to swing round then to the composition. As a strategic workforce planner, you are pulling together your full-time equivalent, your contingent, your shared service, and your automation. So that is the moment then, once you've identified your need, you're then looking at your service delivery model to provide those capabilities. Classically, then, one would work from right to left in terms of having developed that strategic workforce plan. You're then looking to translate that then into your 12-month plan. Before I joined EY, I spent 22 years in the civil service, 10 years of which was within the prison service. So the operational plan became critically important. Each of our prisons were given their budget for the next 12 months. We looked again at what was going to be the demand requirements on each of those prison establishments, and then we looked at the workforce requirements. Incredibly complicated in the prisons world, because apart from your obvious of prison officers, prison governors, we're then looking at psychologists, chaplains, administrative staff to support as well. So that then becomes your 12-month plan. The tactical plan, and again, if I finish off with my prison analogy, will be how many people are going to be turning up day in, day out. So your classic rostering, and how we're going to get best use out of that rostering workforce. And each of your tactical, operational and strategic can be supported and underpinned by technology to enable you to manage that workforce in the most productive way. Then my last slide on workforce planning, I thought it just might be useful to have a look then around that more operational planning, which you might need to do, and provide a decision tree. So if you just take this particular slide, you can normally see that most organisations encounter peak demand. So again, in my time in the Home Office, passport office was a classic example where people often submitted their passport renewals at a particular time of year. That then led into those seasonal deficits. And then that meant if you work your way through the decision tree flow, there was some predictability for them. And then you start to look how you smooth that demand and then what your staffing requirements are. Interestingly, again, you can have unintended consequence of business decisions on your workforce planning. So to carry on again with that passport office analogy, there was the experience of about 20 years ago where Passport Service introduced two policy changes at the same time. One where any child under the age of 5 had to have their own passport. And then second, it coincided with a technology change. That led to an unintended consequence of a peak in demand for passports at the same time. And that led to, again, significant workforce challenges. So you're constantly having to have a look at what might be the drivers of demand and therefore of supply with workforce. So got a couple of slides just to think through and reflect on the tax implications. Again, as employers, as HR people, many of us will be aware of the complexities involved around the different type of worker being employed. Up to about 2000, the workforce model was reasonably stable. So you had permanent, you had agency, you'd had consultancy, but it was becoming very clear in terms of the tax base and the tax position of each of those employees. Since April 2014, there have been 6 new pieces of legislation as the complexity of different type of workers have had different tax consequences. And we're now seeing that now with non-domiciled individuals. We see it as well with immigration, which again is another challenge for HR when employing people. And again, we're seeing constant movements on how, again, contingent workers will set themselves up. This is a real issue for Treasury, so it's not something that is going to go away. You can see from the circle in terms of how many people actually are deemed to be self-employed now, and that then means there's leakage in terms of PAYE. For the Treasury, PAYE matters. There was £405 billion in revenue in 2023 to 24. That was 48% of all tax revenue coming in. So we'll continue to see focus and attention, and there's a responsibility both of the individual and of the employer to ensure they remain on the right side of tax in terms of looking at that adaptive talent workforce. So in conclusion, I've got a couple of differing views in terms of about the benefits, pros and cons of outsourcing. So famous Peter Drucker quote in terms of outsource anything that you don't do best. Personal reflection again on this was as I was just coming in to the office yesterday. We, like many organisations, have an outsourced front of house within EY in terms of our reception, our security. You would not know it. The reception that one receives is very much the reception that we as EY would want to receive. The cultural requirements now, the cultural alignment with your organisation from all of your outsourced workforces is absolutely critical. So you have to be fully confident that you're not just outsourcing where you've got a skills deficit. If you do that, you've got to ensure that a customer experience will be consistent throughout, regardless of who is providing you with that experience. Then we have a more nuanced observation from Bill Gates. If you rely too much on the people in other countries and other companies, in a sense, that's your brain and you are outsourcing your brain. So as said, slightly more nuanced, slightly more considerative. So not always quite as clear cut as just do what you do best and outsource the rest. So I thought I would finish off with that slide and looking forward to questions. But at this point now, I'll hand over to Bernice.
Thank you, John. That was really interesting. So first of all, a little bit about Eastside People. We are an award-winning social enterprise committed to building a thriving and effective charity and not-for-profit sector. And we do that by offering a variety of flexible resourcing solutions so that we're able to respond to the needs of our client in a bespoke manner. That typically involves offering a combination of consultancy, interim support, permanent recruitment, board recruitment, executive advisory services, and mentoring. And over the years of deploying these different kinds of support, I've learned a lot about what works best and when. And in truth, we actually often offer a combination of a number of them at one time. Deploying an interim manager is often the solution that I turn to most frequently. So I'm going to focus on that. And I've drawn on lessons I've learned over the years, along with some insights from both the clients that I've worked with and interim contractors. In truth, though, much of this will apply to any outsourcing situation. So moving on to some practical advice for organizations when you're bringing in or considering bringing in an interim manager. There are many benefits. So flexibility, speed. Interims can generally start a role quickly, which is ideal in a crisis situation or a sudden departure. Contracts are often flexible with minimal long-term commitment. They will bring expertise and a fresh perspective. And typically interims will have a higher level of experience than that particular role requires, or they're bringing in something that's quite niche that you maybe don't have already in the organization. And they can offer objective, unbiased insights, a fresh pair of eyes. They've often done similar roles as well in a number of other organizations. So they're also able to bring that experience with them. They're not caught up in internal politics, which allows them to focus on the job in hand and make tough decisions if needed. They will be delivery focused and results orientated with clear goals and often time limited objectives, which means they really need to get the job done. And also, that they're not spending time on career progression or internal positioning, which, as we know, takes up time. I've often seen interim managers brought in to solve a particular business challenge, for example, leading a complex merger or leading through a change or period of transition. And there are many benefits to bringing in an expert in those kind of situations. An interim resource can also be brought in to maintain continuity or stabilize a situation. One recently that's come up is kind of keeping day-to-day operations running smoothly during a recruitment process, or maintaining morale during a period of sickness. An added benefit of using an interim resource is that whilst they're there, a good interim should really be working to build the skills and competence of your current workforce and empower individuals internally. But there are challenges. The first one is cost. Day rates or short-term contracts can be expensive compared to salaried staff, although of course you don't have the on costs in the same way. Even if it is cost effective to bring in an interim or a contractor in the short term, roles often go on for longer than planned. And that's where I've seen costs sometimes get out of control or outside of budget. Getting the brief right can be challenging, and I've seen this go wrong, I think, for a number of reasons. So often because there isn't a full understanding of the situation the interim is stepping into. And that's particularly common in a turnaround or a crisis scenario where a lot of investigation and diagnosis is needed, really, to understand the true nature of the brief and to make it clear. I've also seen briefs that are overly ambitious with unrealistic expectations about what can be achieved in a short amount of time. So getting the brief right can be difficult. There's a potential lack of long-term investment. So interims are not usually around to see the longer-term impact of their work. They may not invest in deep relationship building or culture shaping unless that's a particular part of their role. One client I spoke to said that though interims can achieve different things in a role compared with permanent staff, in part because they aren't so invested in thinking these people have to like me in 3 years' time. At the same time, it's not fair to expect an interim to be invested in what's actually going to happen in the organisation in 3 years' time. There can also be disruption to team dynamics. Presence of an interim can unsettle existing staff, particularly if the interim is seen as an agent of change or they don't have great communication skills. I've heard stories of interims coming in like a bull in a china shop, which is obviously not going to work well. And some staff may resist temporary leadership as well. And one CEO I spoke to said, you should use interims as a force for good, but be careful about them becoming destabilizing. They can really accelerate things, but you need to make sure that it's not to the detriment of your team. It's very much about your team understanding what that person's brief is, what they're there for, and why they have come in. Risk of overdependence, this I see a lot. So organizations can become reliant on an interim, especially if there's no clear plan for succession or transition. And, because they are often more skilled or more experienced than the role requires, they're going to do an amazing job, and it can be difficult to let them go. And finally, knowledge transfer issues can happen. So there's a risk of knowledge leaving when the interim leaves. A good interim should work around that, but you need to make sure there's a proper handover and there's good documentation processes is in place as well. I'm often asked by people what they should look for in an interim manager. I mean, again, many of these will apply for any outsourced support. I think these are the key ones outside of the particular knowledge and expertise needed in whatever the particular situation that you're bringing them in for is. And bear in mind, these are this is focusing on senior roles, just to be clear. So a good interim will be motivated by complex, challenging situations with demanding timeframes. It's not for everyone. Some of the people I've worked with really love going from role to role as an interim and adapting to each situation, and others find they're much more suited to a permanent role where, without as much change. They should be adaptable and flexible, comfortable with new changing environments and teams. So ideally, a big picture person who's also able to home in on major points of challenge, underperformance, or areas of dysfunction. Strong interpersonal communication and people management skills are really important, as is the ability to analyze quickly the pivotal issues facing an organization and implement a program of action. Many interims I've spoken to have some form of a diagnostic process when they first go into an organization in order to get to understand the situation as quickly as possible. They'll also need to be skilled at navigating challenging situations, but dealing with them sensitively. So a recent situation I resourced an interim for, there were some major disagreements among the SLT and the board of that organisation that needed to be unpicked before any action could be taken. And when the interim manager first went in, she spent quite a lot of time mediating really and sorting out that situation so they could move on. A good interim should be self-sufficient and proactive and results orientated, and also confident about what they're there to do and the role that they're playing. So some tips here on how to make the most of an interim appointment as a manager. So make the use of an interim manager as a critical friend and make the most of the perspectives that they bring. They bring a fresh pair of eyes in the team, a wealth of experience from the various postings they've had. Ask for their insight and knowledge at an early stage while their view is still fresh. Even if they're coming in to do a hold the fort type of role, it's not a change role. They will bring insight and perspectives that will be interesting, in any case. Setting clear objectives. So understand the subtleties and differences between an interim and a permanent role, and be clear on what objectives you're trying to achieve with this intervention. Think of it as rather than thinking of a job description when you bring in an interim, think through what are the key things I need this person to achieve in the next 3 to 6 months, and then make sure you communicate those well. But also keep checking in on progress during the assignment. Aiming for good starts and good ends. Preparing in advance of an interim manager starting, so that might involve setting up key meetings with key stakeholders early on, sending through information before they start, strategy, business plans, etc. At the end of an assignment, giving adequate time for handover and embedding of knowledge before they leave. That's really where they can add great value. Bringing other stakeholders on board, so important to communicate to your team why the interim manager is there, why you're bringing them in, what they'll be doing, what their aims are. They'll need to assimilate and be listened to if they're going to be effective, so that communication is really important. And then finally, make the effort. So understand the interim manager and their motivations as you would with any new team member. Put effort into the relationship and you'll get more back. It's a small professional world often, your paths may cross again. And the other thing I get here a lot is an assumption that they want a permanent role or can't get a permanent role. And more often than not, that's not the case. They've chosen a portfolio career. So moving on to advice for people going in as an interim to organizations. So these are some of the personal characteristics that I think and I've seen work well as an interim. So having confidence about going cold into new situations, being ready to shift into high gear without necessarily knowing a great deal about the organization or its challenges. At times I've brought people in where the CEO perhaps has gone off very suddenly and it's been quite hard to get a good deal of information to them before they start. Being good at the people thing. You'll need to be engaged, an empathetic leader, able to build trust and confidence quickly, willing to take the time to listen and to learn. To lead successful change or transformation, you need to bring people with you and include them in the journey. And it can be difficult as a contractor to settle in you're not a permanent member of staff. So prioritizing rapport building, listening actively, being open to feedback will all help with that. The ability to get to grips with culture and internal politics quickly is also important. So observing behavior and asking lots of questions can help with that. Pay attention to tension points or what's not being said in meetings. And sometimes one person said it's the obvious questions that people aren't asking are the ones you need to ask. Interim managers need an ability to see the big picture and avoid being pulled into the weeds, but also need to be happy to roll sleeves up and get the job done as needed, and to be quite flexible in that sense. You need to be prepared to raise difficult issues sensitively, particularly when giving feedback on challenges and solutions. One interim I spoke to said this is often an issue when he presents his sort of initial report of findings to an organisation, because he's uncovered potentially some quite tricky stuff. And finally, it's not for everyone, although many enjoy a portfolio career and love the challenge and variety you can have. One of the interim managers I spoke to said she loves being able to take action and feels she can have a really big impact in each role she goes into, and also likes the fact that she can be more direct than she felt she could be in her permanent roles. So tips for making the most of the role. Having a clear remit with realistic deliverables and something that fits with your skills. Choose roles where your skills and experience really do match the skills required for the assignment, because you won't have time to learn on the job. Look after yourself as an interim. Working freelance, you're running your own business. It's important to network, build contacts with good interim providers or consultancy providers, expand your knowledge. Having resilience and a positive attitude are key to building your project base and network. Definitely expect peaks and troughs. Interim contracts are generally very intense, but they are always interspersed with periods of downtime. Enjoy the time out, but you might think about saving money, for when you're next working. And that means you won't be compelled to take the first opportunity that comes up next. And you can then choose projects that feel more aligned to your skill sets, your values and your interests. Managing expectations on both sides is key. People tend to listen hardest in your first and last meetings with them. So working closely with clients to agree clear objectives from the start and establishing clear lines of reporting and accountability will really help. Start simply by asking, how can you help? What issues are they facing? Keep in mind assignments are often more challenging than was initially described or expected. And at the end, ask them what worked well, what didn't. What can you do as you leave? And that will inform your practice as you move on to your next role. Going in with the right mindset. Interim work is vastly different from permanent work. You need to be comfortable with lots of hellos and goodbyes and prepared not to see the end result of initiatives you've created. On the other hand, you'll gain a lot from meeting and working with a wide range of people, building your network and gaining new experiences. And finally, and this is my last slide, keep the human touch. Be honest without being brutal or hypercritical. Express yourself authentically as a problem solver, even if you've been recruited as a constructive disruptor to challenge the status quo in a dysfunctional organization. You need to be personable, working to gain trust and respect. Thank you. I'm now going to hand over back to Dalton for questions.
Thank you very much, Bernice and John. Really very interesting presentations from both of you. Really much appreciated. I think there's a lot from both of them, actually, just listening to you, John, and things that were resonating with me around people making their choice and actually being empowered. Lots of emphasis on skills, which I think is really crucial these days. And it's interesting when you were talking about interim managers, Bernice, particularly your last slide. You can think about the sort of the technical side of being an interim manager, but in my mind, that those softer skills, those basic needs, particularly in the current pace of change that we're all experiencing around looking after yourself and making sure that you keep the human touch, just seem to resonate. So it's one thing having the tactical skills or the technical skills to do a job, but actually just let's not forget that we're all human beings and we need to treat each other in a certain way. So I think there's something to be said for that. I suppose a general question, Bernice, you talked a little bit about adaptability and flexibility. Can you think of any situations where you feel staff haven't been adaptable or flexible, examples, and how that might go wrong for organisations when people are not prepared to be adaptable to the changing needs of their organisation?
I have seen that, and I think the communication bit is so key in those kind of situations. So I would say I've probably most seen it where an interim is coming into a senior role like the CEO role, and there were perhaps people in the organization that felt they could have acted up into the role, and so there's a whole load of politics you're then navigating around that. And that requires but on whoever's kind of made that decision to bring them in needs to be communicating with the team, and for the person coming in, you're immediately starting from a difficult point of view. I think there's something there about just involving people, talking to people, explaining to them why you're there, involving them in decisions. And typically, a good interim will win people round in those situations, I think.
Fantastic, thank you. John, do you want to add to that at all? Any thoughts you've got?
I think my only observation would be, I think the lack of adaptability, if anything, I see it sometimes in a more permanent workforce where, because again, there is permanency, and sometimes, again, people can get a little bit rigid in the ways of their working, and some organisations maybe aren't as welcoming as well, and understanding of that, and it does place a particular skill set on the interim to be able to manage the sensitivity sometimes of how they land within an organisation.
Yeah, it makes good sense. John, you talked a little bit about roles or skills, not roles, in terms of emphasis. I guess for people that feel that they haven't got the skills to be able to move through their organisation and want that support through their organisation to try and improve those skills, what approach would EY take, or would you take, to ensuring that people are able to provide that sort of self-development route?
Again, it was just reflecting on one or two of the observations around Bernice. So I think your last finishing point, Bernice, was around being human to people. So when you're now looking at skills, as well alongside your technical skill set, in terms of, particularly again for those who are working more in a temporary work market, that's the first port of call quite often around why you're actually looking at bringing someone into your organisation. And the same applies actually for people who are permanent as well. What is your functional technical skill? As critical then are two other different types of skill sets. Sometimes those competencies that we talk about, such as problem solving, ability to communicate, but the really important part is actually the ability to be empathetic, to be to actually think about person, think around customer, service, user. It's like a completely different skill set now that we're asking of people, and people are also having to work out how to navigate or network through internally within organizations, and how to understand what you can control, what you can influence. So within an organization such as EY, we don't have a line manager, we have a counsellor. So that's actually the name of I counsel rather than line manage about half a dozen people. And my responsibility is obviously to set the performance goals and as much to, again, help them with their development. It relies very much on a feedback loop as well. So again, we work in major disease environments, but regardless, how you bring in feedback from other people with whom your counselees work. And then finally, we know most of our work experience is experiential, and then it's just more where you need to deal with some of those gaps more around the technical. So my use of Copilot and AI, I fess I'm at the foundation stages. Having got the license, I've been given my initial formal learning, but then it will be the trialing and using.
Brilliant. I didn't think we'd get through this webinar without AI being mentioned, so thanks, John. So we've got a question from, I think it's Denise, pronunciation, I hope that's right, Denise, and it's for you, Bernie. Thank you for sharing your advice. Please elaborate on an experience for leadership after interim managers leave. Any advice on how to fill the gap should companies to prepare within?
Okay. So what I've seen worked well is if there can be a handover period. So if they're covering a particular role, if there can be an overlap handover period, that works brilliantly. If they're coming in to do something that and there isn't somebody coming in to replace them, again, it's about time with the relevant staff. So making sure you plan it. I think that's the key thing overall, not letting it be an abrupt ending, planning around it. So there might be, I think I mentioned about documentation, but kind of asking the interim to make notes on kind of what it is they've done and kind of where they think the organization needs to go next, and sharing that, and also speaking to key members of staff about it works really well. Yeah, I think those are the main thing. It's the planning. Too often it just isn't planned, and you're not thinking about, this person's going to leave this skill gap. Is this something I need going forward? And it might be that you actually realize it's been such a useful thing to have. You want to recruit in a permanent form for somebody with those skills. It's just thinking about it and not letting it happen to you, being proactive around it.
Yeah. Really good point, Bernice. I'm going to we have had some questions, so I want to make sure we make some time to do that. John, can I ask you, what organisational boundaries have you found yourself navigating when setting up a new team or a business unit?
Just one of the experiences can be, in terms of starting up a new team, are again how you're working both with HR and sometimes with procurement. And it is a curiosity to me that, again, we don't have much more of an integrated aligned approach in most of our organisations, and you have different routes coming in and you have different people managing them in very different ways. And I find HR quite conversant with working with permanent employees. I think procurement, again, take a procurement contractual approach to how to manage, bring in temporary workforces, and that can be really challenging. If you're on a larger scale as well, sometimes when you're more setting up a team and you're going to be working globally, that again presents different challenges too. Sometimes you can find we're talking about two teams, not one team. So it's so important that there's those team meetings are definitely one team. We're respectful of time boundaries, respectful of maybe different cultural ways of working, that it's not, in our case, a UK-led and global support. So that understanding the dynamics of the team, enabling that feedback to come through is really vital to setting a team up successfully.
Thank you, John. We had a question from Sarah. Bernice, I'm going to ask you this. How do you encourage hiring for potential rather than past experience?
There's a number of ways to do this, and so there's, I mean, an obvious one is kind of blind CVs, so anonymizing and taking off some of the details of where somebody has worked can help with that. Another thing I found has worked well is skill-based questions. So if you're feeling like you're able to, actually taking out the whole CV and the cover letter, removing all of that and asking a set of questions that are very much aligned to what is this person going to be doing in the job. And then you, I mean, in an ideal process, you would take those questions in, score those, have a panel scoring them, and only then start to look at CVs and the skills match. And then hopefully that person then has been able to show their potential rather than relying too heavily on what they've done in the past.
Brilliant. Yeah, I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan of hiring for potential, not perfection. And your examples, anonymizing CVs, etc., really help that. I also quite like it when employers decide to share the questions for an interview before they attend the interview, so you really get the best of that person rather than any potential, nerves that people naturally have when they go for new jobs. We've had an anonymous question, actually. I think there's a bear in the icon. Do you have any experience where your subordinate reacts, no respect, and as a leader, what should we do? How to build an effective team if there is no cooperation at all? John, do you want to kick us off with that?
All right, thank you for that one. So have I had experience? Well, I guess I have, because I've been working quite a long time. So we've all had that within our teams. So sometimes it's working out, is this a wider team issue, or is it an issue about an individual? So sometimes where a team is not connecting, not gelling, there can be a dealing with it in a team way rather than dealing directly with the individual. So I have found that we've actually had to maybe work out a ways of working charter, because actually quite a lot of this is quite behaviourally driven as well. So again, you're being really clear and in a very practical way, talking about how your organisational values actually translate then into in a practical way. What is an effective way of working in terms of how we interact with each other respectfully, how we listen, don't interrupt, etc. So sometimes actually translating it into that. Again, with leadership teams, I've actually done team development around high performing teams, and that is really interesting because its foundational requirement is you have to have trust as a team. Before then you can actually have what is called healthy conflict, because you don't want to have emotive and finger pointing conflict, but you can't have those genuine calling out where you have a disagreement unless you've actually found out the way of building trust. When it comes down to individuals, there has to again be, we've got various guides on having difficult conversations, and I know those are available elsewhere. ACAS have got some really good guidelines as well, and that again is the needing that one-to-one, being really clear around the purpose of it, and again listening, understanding what actually might be the provocations, the trigger points that are leaving subordinates to overreact. And then at the end, still needing to be really clear about the behaviours and the ways of working that are required. And sometimes then it is having to continue to lead to a performance management requirement. I don't know if you've experienced some of this too.
That's
I was
great.
going to say, one thing I've seen can work. If it's about, sometimes there's something about the team not understanding each kind of person and how they communicate and how they work, and so doing some kind of an exercise like Belbin's team types or something like that, which shows that actually this person's a real thinker, they're not particularly out there, they're quite introverted, and that's why they're being quiet. It's not because they're being rude, and this, I mean, and that you may be beyond that point, but those kind of things can help as well.
Yeah, brilliant. I think it's so important, isn't it, as leaders, to model the behaviour you expect and lead by example, or kind of obvious stuff, but actually some leaders don't do that. And to the point around a performance management model that focuses on the values of that organisation and the behaviours expected, that sounds very sensible. Okay, I'm conscious that the time is whizzing away. Bernice, I have a question for you. What business challenges have flexible workforces helped you solve?
Well, I mentioned some of them in the presentation. I mean, it's scaling up, scaling down is an obvious one. Filling skill gaps or sickness gaps. Managing cost or reducing risk is another. It can be used to bring in more diversity, both of perspectives and background. one I've seen recently was sort of testing out a new role. So an organisation that thought they needed a particular kind of role, but weren't really sure. So I've started off on an interim basis with a view to them recruiting permanently. Or just freeing up resource. Another one where they're a fairly small charity that's growing, and the CEO wants to be able to focus more on strategy and networking, and so we're bringing in an operational resource to give her the time to do that.
Thank you. John, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I'll just briefly come in. So obviously sitting within a very large consulting firm, our whole model is premised actually on having flexible workforces. So it's viewing work as more projects sometimes rather than as a business as usual requirement. Now, not all work is like that. I recognise that. And then it is around, in our case, how you pull together different teams from different capabilities to deliver time-bound projects. And I think that flexibility gives us more agility, and therefore in how we meet demand very quickly as well. We're much more we make much more use of external, particularly SMEs as well, because as Bernice said, you get greater diversity of thought and content and solutions for client by working with other companies as well when tendering and delivering work. So we found that invaluable.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. Bernice, you talked about interim roles and the pros and cons, but if you think generally in terms of a contractor, a freelancer, or a supplier, how do they settle into an organisation if given that you're not a permanent member of that team?
I think there's something about it's kind of, I mentioned earlier about asking lots of questions when you're coming in and being really clear on what your role and scope is. When you first come into an organisation, building relationships, building rapport will help you to settle. Regular communication. So quite often I've seen there's a lot of communication at the start, and then it dwindles a bit, particularly when you're working remotely or on a hybrid basis. So keeping that going. And then another thing I think helps is quickly coming in and showing your value, showing your expertise. People will immediately start accepting and opening things out to you. I mean, the other thing I would say as well is, if you're going in, if you're a career contractor or interim or whatever, you probably won't get a great deal in terms of peer support in the organizations you work in, but there are organizations you can join, like CMI or others, where you can develop a peer network to get that support.
Brilliant. That's a nice plug. So if for those thinking about it, obviously most people here are members of CMI, but if you're not and you're thinking about it, Bernice has just said that's what you need to do. We have come to an end, sadly, so I'd like to first of all thank you both, John and Bernice, for your insight, your expertise, before handing back to Mary to close us down. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dalton.
Pleasure.
So that's it for today's session. Thank you to our host, Dalton, and to our speakers, Bernice and John, for your insight and expertise. Please stay tuned to hear more about CMI membership, and thank you for joining us.
Don't forget, as a CMI member, you can find the latest management and leadership insights at managers.org.uk. If you're not yet a member, join our community to discover CMI Confidence with on-demand resources, our network of mentors, and industry-leading accreditations.